Workers have no motherland. This is the first universal identification of the proletariat by Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. In their view, although the proletariat must first gain political domination, rise to the leading class of the nation, and organize itself as a nation, with the development of the bourgeoisie, with the realization of trade freedom and the establishment of the world market, with the uniformity of industrial production and the conditions of life corresponding to it, national divisions and antagonisms between peoples are increasingly disappearing. The domination of the proletariat will further hasten the disappearance of nations. United action, at least the civilized countries, the united action of the proletariat is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. As soon as the class antagonisms within the nation disappear, the antagonism between the nations will also disappear. Therefore, the proletariat is neither nationalist nor nationalist. Those who are not nationalists, but internationalists. According to Raymond Aron's understanding, Marx, as the theoretical prophet of the proletariat, endowed this class with the status of the chosen class, undertaking the historical mission of liberating all mankind. The proletarians of the world unite to finally completely eliminate classes, nations, and countries, and use communism, internationalism, to achieve the ultimate liberation of mankind. In the grand blueprint of international communism described by Marx, the discourse of classism is the only struggle language that the proletariat needs to master, while the discourse of nationalism has always been orthodox because it covers or erases the class struggle relationship within the nation. Marxists are placed within the sphere of bourgeois ideology. For the proletariat without a motherland, promoting a national consciousness that does not distinguish between classes is tantamount to promoting a consciousness that transcends class, which hinders the growth of their class consciousness. Marx always placed the national question in the class relationship for research, and regarded the nation of the peasants as being subordinate to the nation of the bourgeoisie as the last stage of the nation, and the historical process of industry and trade pioneered by capitalism in all countries of the world. In the end, a unified national class interest and a unified nation are formed. 2. The proletariat became the unified representative of the nation, and the unified government it established in the revolution abolished the fatherland and at the same time abolished the nation. In theory, Marx announced the cancellation of the national question, but in fact the national question has existed for a long time in the history of the international communist movement, and the national question and democratic question have become the two major problems of the internal fission of Marxism. Otto Bauer, the founder of Austrian Marxism, wrote and published the book National Questions and Social Democracy in 1907, which put national questions above class questions for the first time in the study of Marxist theory. He believes that in an era of great national struggle, science needs to conduct in-depth research on the essence of the nation. The objective existence of the nation is an undeniable historical fact. National struggle and class struggle should simultaneously become part of the proletarian revolutionary cause. National self-determination should be the core demand of the Austrian Social Democratic Party. He emphasizes that the socialist national principle is not aimed at abolishing the nation but at recognizing the legitimacy of the nation's existence. The change of people due to the socialist mode of production will inevitably lead to the division of human beings into national communities. The international division of labor will inevitably lead to the unification of national communities into a new higher-level social structure. All nations are united for the common control of nature, but the whole is divided into national communities that are entitled to independent development and free enjoyment of their own national culture. This is the national principle of socialism. 3. Establishing the national principle as the basic principle of socialism, seeing the victory of socialism not as the demise of the nation but as the realization of the national community, Powell thus replanned the political tasks of the Austrian Social Democratic Party, to build Austria into a state of the democratic union of nationalities, composed of self-governing groups bounded by nationalities, the legislation and administration of each group being administered by a national assembly. Elected on the basis of universal, direct, and equal suffrage, autonomous regions belonging to the same nation form a single national alliance, which handles the affairs of the ethnic group completely according to the principle of self-government. The ethnic minorities in each autonomous region should be formed into public law groups, and these groups are managed completely according to the principle of self-government. For it can be seen that the national question that Powell is committed to solving in the Social Democratic program is not only to solve the problem of national self-determination, but also to solve the problem of national autonomy, and nation and democracy have become highly related issues. Powell's major breakthrough in Marxist national theory represented a trend of revisionism within the Second International. He actually followed in Bernstein's footsteps and challenged Marx's theory of class struggle and violent revolution. Lenin and Stalin certainly seem to be such gross betrayals of Marxism that they cannot be tolerated. The article Marxism and the National Question, published by Stalin in 1913, was praised by Lenin as the premier Marxist theoretical document in the party. This article was mainly aimed at the wave of nationalism set off by Powell, believes that the tide of nationalism is surging day by day, and it is likely to sweep the working masses. The lower the liberation movement is, the more flowers of nationalism will bloom. The major mission of the Russian Bolshevik Party is to use the tried and tested international. It is based on the historical view of class struggle that Stalin recognizes the existence of nations and believes that a nation is a historically formed group of people with a common language and a common region, a common economic life, and a stable community with a common psychological quality expressed in a common culture. 6. But he always believed that the labor movement could not be conducted according to the principle of nation but only according to the principle of class. Workers, if organized by nation, it would be confined to national cliques, separated from each other by organizational barriers. In this way, the emphasis would not be on what the workers had in common with each other, but what made them different from each other. 7. In Stalin's mind, in order to shape the working class into a unified and complete whole, and then combine this collective into a unified party, it must be organized according to the transnational principle, while national, the form of organization, is a school for national narrowness and national conservatism. Stalin's understanding of the national question essentially opposed the national view with the class view, emphasizing that the unity of the proletariat among all nationalities is a necessary condition for solving the national question. Hobsbawm once believed in the book Nation and Nationalism that in the half-century before 1914, there was a tense relationship between the nationalist movement and the socialist movement. However, when the First World War broke out in 1914, it immediately proved that the internationalism advocated by the socialists was simply an unrealistic castle in the air, and at the post-war peace conference in 1918, the national principle and achieved a complete victory again. 8. Lenin apparently also realized the need to adjust the national policy of the Bolshevik Party in a timely manner after the outbreak of the First World War. Far more radical than Rosa Luxemburg's nationalist claim is that independent nation-states create the conditions for the fullest development of commodity production and the freest, broadest, and most rapid development of capitalism. Therefore, the right of nations to self-determination, in essence, it cannot have any meaning other than political self-determination, that is, national independence and the establishment of a nation-state. 9. Not only that, Lenin further believed that the recognition of the right of nations to self-determination is the recognition of the nation's right to secession, for which he set the double task for the Russian proletariat. On the one hand, it is necessary to oppose all nationalisms, first of all great Russian nationalism. It is necessary not only to recognize the complete equality of all nations in general, but also to recognize equality in the establishment of states, that is, to recognize the right of national self-determination, the right of national separation. On the other hand, it is precisely in order to fight victoriously against nationalism among all nations that it is necessary to uphold the unity of the proletarian struggle and proletarian organization so that they are closely fused into an international whole despite the bourgeois tendencies towards national isolation. X. Lenin's above remarks were an attempt to introduce the increasingly popular nationalist discourse into the Marxist discourse system on the premise of adhering to internationalism. This was a discourse strategy adjustment that the development of the international situation forced him to make. The First World War led to the disintegration of the Second International, and the internationalist line of the European labor movement was declared bankrupt. Rosa Luxemburg, as a thorough internationalist, was still immersed in the myth of internationalism when she had an argument with Lenin about the right of national self-determination. When one after another chose to support the war policy of her own government, she experienced an unprecedented despair. This is the first time that there has been a gap between the needs of the proletariat for international solidarity and the interests of the freedom and national existence of the peoples of all countries. For the first time it was discovered that the independence and freedom of nations urgently demanded that proletarians speaking different languages kill each other and exterminate each other. Previously we were convinced that the interests of nations and the class interests of the proletarians were in harmony, identical, and distinct from each other. Antagonisms can arise. This has been the basis of our theory and practice, the soul of our agitation among the masses of the people. We are confronted with the question of the life and death of international socialism. 11. If Lenin is viewed from Luxemburg's point of view, the latter seems to have completely deviated from the internationalist line established by Marx, not only in favor of opposing the nationalism of Great Russia, but also in favor of all weak and small nations enjoying the right of national self-determination and the right to establish a state. However, in fact Lenin did not step back from the internationalist line. The premise of national self-determination he advocated was the establishment of Bolshevik-style political rule. After the victory of the October Revolution in 1917, Lenin's views on the right of national self-determination underwent major changes. The nation has the right to establish an independent state. He emphasized that the national policy of the Communist International cannot be limited to an empty, formal, and purely declarative recognition of national equality like the bourgeois democrats. The Soviet system that first unites the proletariat and then the entire working masses in the struggle can actually give equality to all nations. 12. The new internationalist line planned by the Communist International is to mobilize the proletariat of all countries in the world to devote themselves to a united front in defense of the world's first Red regime. Sovietism became synonymous with internationalism, and nationalism was once again synonymous with national opportunism. 13. Was the victory of the Soviet October Revolution a victory of internationalism or nationalism? In fact, this is the victory of nationalism. The national question studied by Lenin and Stalin was never for the self-determination or independence of the nationalities in Russia, but for how the Bolshevik Party could use the wave of nationalism to seize state power as soon as possible and monopolize all power. As Hobsbawm said, the national principle of the 19th century triumphed. From Central Europe to Eastern Europe, the multi-ethnic empires gradually collapsed. Except for Russia, no country in Europe is based on the Bolshevik Party national question policy. For the first time ever, the European puzzle is composed almost entirely of nation-states, all of which have some kind of bourgeois parliamentary democracy. 14. But only the Soviet regime led by Lenin and Stalin allowed neither national self-determination nor national autonomy. The sole purpose of the internationalist revolution they advocated was to fully mobilize all political and economic forces in the world to serve the long-term existence of the Soviet regime. Lenin clearly pointed out this point. The entire history of the Russian working class and the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party has given them all the conditions to adopt an internationalist, that is, truly revolutionary and thoroughly revolutionary strategy. 15. Therefore, asserting that the theory of nationalism represents a historic failure of Marxism, 16 is a major misjudgment. In a revolutionary country guided by Marxism, all kinds of clamor of nationalism will never be the herald of national self-determination or national independence, and they will eventually be integrated into the chorus dominated by nationalism. The problem of nationalism in Confucian perspective. The trend of nationalism and its movement is a historical phenomenon in Europe in the 19th century. On the one hand, it corresponds to the rise of European nation-states, and on the other hand, it corresponds to the collapse of the old dynastic system. By 1922, the once mighty Habsburg, Hohenzollern, Romanov, and Ottoman dynasties had perished successively, replaced by the nation-state-based national founding movement in Central and Eastern Europe. According to Gittin's understanding, the origin of modern European society is by no means the result of the separate effects of capitalism, rationalism, and industrialism, but a process of institutional agglomeration, especially a process related to nation-state. The accompanying process of unique social integration. 17. Or as understood by Douglas North and Robert Thomas, the nation-state is the highest form of political organization reached by the evolution of European history since the 16th century. 18. Hobsbawm made an incisive summary of the nation-building movement surging in Europe since the 19th century. The liberal bourgeoisie was arguably the protagonist on the stage of European history in the 19th century, especially during the period when the principle of nations redrawn the map of Europe in a most dramatic way, that is, during the 50 years from 1830 to 1880. Even if they were unwilling in every possible way, they had to face many problems caused by the national principle. First, the unification movement of Germany and Italy disrupted the balance of power that the European powers painstakingly maintained, split, after signing the 1867 Compromise, followed by Belgium in Western Europe and the Ottoman Turkish Empire in Southeast Europe, later split into Greece, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria. Also demanding the establishment of sovereign states based on national principles. At the same time, there were also 2 riots in Poland, demanding that the territory be redivided according to national principles in order to establish a national state. This magnificent national independence movement is a historical trend that no one can resist. It is no wonder that Weishaupt thinks, national creation is the 19th central key to the historical development of the century. 19. In the tide of nation-state independence set off in Europe, China's ancient empires as prisons of nations also cannot stand alone. The rulers of the empire and their Confucian scholars are facing a common problem of the times: can the dynastic state autonomously transformed into a modern nation-state? In the traditional discourse system of Confucianism, there has always been only the concept of family, country, and world without the concept of nation, and there is no self-identity of the Chinese nation. The history of China is the history of dynasty rule by one family and one family name. The concept of discrimination between Hua and Yi, it embodies a racist theory of cultural superiority, and the tributary system under heaven is incompatible with the modern nation-state system. Liang Kikao was the first to realize the importance of the awakening of nationalism for the country's modern transformation. Since the 16th century, about 400 years ago, the development of Europe and the progress of the world are all driven by nationalism. What are nationalists? People of the same race, language, religion, and customs everywhere treat each other as compatriots, and strive for independence and self-government. A well-organized government is to seek public welfare and control other races. The core essence of his theory of new people is to revitalize China with nationalism, and use the spirit of nationalism to call for the morality, wisdom, and power of the people of 400 million people. About 30 years after Liang Kikao published Xi and Minshou, China has entered an important moment in the development of nationalism. Sino-Japanese ethnic conflicts have intensified. The two countries are about to enter an all-out war. National salvation has become the theme of the times, and nationalist thoughts and spirits have been mobilized, become an imminent task for the intellectual community. It was at this moment that Zhang Junmei lamented the lack of national consciousness in China. National consciousness is the element that enables the people to stand majestically in the universe, and it is also called national self-consciousness. Those who live in the environment are mostly barbarians. Their cultural relic system is far inferior to mine, and their culture cannot compete with mine. However, I treat my neighbors with generosity, so for thousands of years, the environment for cultivating national consciousness, the people of our country are filled with the idea of the world, not the national idea. Since the Qin and Han dynasties in our country, although the territory of the nation has expanded day by day, because of less contact with foreign enemies, this world concept, the mentality of nationalism, has never been eliminated, and the concept of a nation-state has never been cultivated, so China has never embarked on the road of a modern state. XXI. It is precisely based on the above judgment that Zhang Junmei, like Liang Kikao, strives to create a new generation of Chinese people and is determined to reshape the Chinese national spirit. A big mission. The nationalism issue in the Confucian perspective and the ethnic issue understood by Marxism have certain similarities in form. The principles of internationalism have similar approaches but the same effect, but neither of them can resist the fission of nationalism from within, although this fission presents multiple aspects of different nature. If it is said that Powell's theory of national self-determination appealed to a right of national autonomy and nation-building, and Lenin's support for national self-determination was just a feint, then Confucian nationalist demands are not only aimed at reform, Kanyawei, or overthrow, Zhang Taiyan, the Manchu ruling group, but also a resistance to national imperialism, Liang Kikao. These Han representatives of modern Confucianism were full of complex nationalist complexes when dealing with foreign, Manchu, rule and foreign, Western, invasion. In his research on Kanyawei's Great Harmony thought, Xiao Gongquan pointed out three kinds of reactions of late Qing intellectuals to the impact of Western civilization. One is conservatives, who do not think there is any problem with Chinese traditions, and completely dislike imitating Western learning. Take Warren as an example. Representatives. One is the extreme anti-traditionalists, who believe that Chinese tradition is useless and must be westernized unconditionally, represented by He, Qi and Hula Yuan. Between the two is a large group of people who do not think that Chinese tradition and westernization, they believe that fire and water are incompatible, but believe that Chinese culture will eventually become globalized. To elevate Chinese culture to the common level of the world. According to Xiao Gongquan's understanding, Kanyawei belonged to the leader of this group of people. His Great Harmony thought most concentratedly reflected a Confucian cosmopolitan, Tianxia, stance, emphasizing the morality of imperial Confucianism. Although the factors are far from the ideal, they are after all the second best. In order to guide people to transition from the troubled world to the peaceful world, the value system of contemporary literature is essentially consistent with Western democracy and socialism. It is in this sense that Xiao Gongquan classified Kang Youwei into the scope of cultural nationalism and believed that Kang's emphasis on preserving China's national quintessence is unavoidably close to what I call cultural nationalism. Some people say that the early nationalist tendency found its basis in past traditions, and like to talk about the national soul. Kang may not be an ordinary or standard nationalist. No matter what kind of nationalism he adopts, it has world elements, is quite evident in his thinking. XXII. As Xiao Gongquan pointed out, Kang Youwei was undoubtedly the first wave of Confucian thought leaders who opened their eyes to see the world during the great changes in the late Qing dynasty. But it did not have any significant impact on actual political changes, and his cultural nationalism was basically on the defensive against the continued spread of westernization. In 1897, Kang Youwei presided over the establishment of the Protecting the National Congress, organized mobilization to mobilize the majority of Confucian scholars to participate in the reform. However, in the eyes of Manchu officials, whether Baoguo is consistent with Bao Xiaoting needs to be questioned. The meanings of protecting the country and protecting the species of nationalism are completely different for Manchu and Han officials. Kang Youwei has always advocated the theory of the assimilation of the Manchu and the Han. The dynasty of the country is long and prosperous, and there is a Xia and Mongolia, Zunhui and Bizang are unified. Therefore, he asked the emperor to implement the integration of the monarch and the people, and the separation of the Manchu and the Han, with the hearts of 400 million people as one. Who else is my enemy? How about looking around and fearing our neighbors and enemies? XXII accepted by the Manchu Qing ruling group. The distinction between Manchu and Han is based on the unshakable ancestral system of the Qing dynasty, and it cannot be accepted by ethnic nationalists like Zhang Tadian. It has been 260 years. Therefore, China is not a national revolution, but a national restoration. The generation of the same race is called revolution, liberation. XXIV Zhang Tadian's revolutionary attitude became more and more radical in just a few years, from on the Emperor Kadai, 1899, to unraveling braided hair, 1900, and then to refuting Kang Youwei's theory of revolution, 1903, pointing the finger of criticism at Emperor Guangxu, the supreme ruler of the Qing dynasty. Zaiun Clown, who did not distinguish between wheat and wheat, took risks, and angrily criticized Manchuria for temporarily controlling 400 million Han Chinese with 5 million people and more than 40 million people. In fact, it is the result of the establishment of corruption to fool the obstruction. XXV Therefore, he believes that the poor social customs, moral decline, and bad administration in China are all directly caused by the Manchu rulers and have nothing to do with the legal system. The essence of China's ethnic issue is racial issue, and the essence of the Chinese Revolution is a racial revolution, which is to overthrow the foreign rule of the Manchu and Qing dynasties. Wang Rongzhu thinks about this. National revolution is the most important part of Zhang Tadian's thoughts and life. In this regard, there are two biggest ones. The first is fullness, and the second is anti-imperialism. XXVI. Suppression of Manchuria and anti-imperialism were not only Zhang Tadian's main theoretical concerns, but also became common topics of thought among intellectuals in the late Qing dynasty. Has never forgotten to remind people to be alert to the threat of national imperialism from Europe and the United States. He regarded the spheres of influence divided by Western powers in China, such as the Russians in Manchuria, the Germans in Shandong, the British in the Yangtze River Valley, the legal persons in Guangdong and Guangxi, and the Japanese in Fujian, as the division of China by national imperialism. Since the Sino-British Opium War in 1840, the Manchu Qing government had been forced to sign a series of treaties humiliating the country with foreign powers, which dealt a heavy blow to the national dignity of Chinese intellectuals and also a huge driving force for their national sentiment to continue to rise. Choosing to use nationalism to resist national imperialism is one of Liang Qiqiu's suggestions to the country. Today, if we want to resist the national imperialism of the great powers and save lives by saving the catastrophe, we can only practice nationalism. If you want to implement nationalism in China, you must give up the new people and find freedom. XXVII The huge external pressure facing China and the international situation surrounded by powerful enemies have given all intellectuals a sense of urgency to subjugate the country and species. At the juncture of national survival, suppression of Manchuria and anti-imperialism naturally became the main demands of nationalism. If Kang Youwei's theory of great harmony is cultural nationalism, Zhang Tadian's theory of racial revolution is racial nationalism, and Liang Kikao's theory of nation-state is liberal nationalism, then Sun Yat-sen clearly defined nationalism has risen to the height of the nation-building program, which can be called political nationalism. XXVIII in 1894, Sun Yat-sen led the establishment of the Xingzonghui. The name of this organization is full of nationalism, and the declaration of its establishment also announced to the world the national crisis facing China. Fans overwhelm the border, dignified China, disdain neighbors, and cultural relics are crowned, and are treated less than foreigners. XXIX The mission of the Xingzonghui is to save the people from the fire and water, and to help the building that is about to collapse. The concept of Xinzhong and Kang Youwei's concept of protecting the country is quite different. By 1905, when the Tongmenghui was established, the slogan of expelling Manchuria was publicly put forward for the first time: expel the Tartars, restore China, establish the Republic of China, and equalize land rights. The Tongmenghui Manifesto denounced the Manchu Qing government for taking advantage of China's troubles, driving into the customs for a long time, and destroying China. According to our government, we forced our Han people to be their slaves. Those who disobeyed would kill hundreds of millions. Our Han people are the people of the subjugated country. 160 years in Sri Lanka. XXX in the same year, in the Minbao publication, Sun Yat-sen formally proposed the Three People's Principles: nation, civil rights, and people's livelihood, and listed nationalism as the first article of the Three People's Principles. According to the Three Principles of the People, the three major tasks of national revolution, political revolution, and social revolution are as follows. The purpose of our revolution is to seek happiness for China. We do not want a minority of Manchus to be autocratic, so we need a national revolution. We don't want a single monarch to be autocratic, so we need a political revolution. XXXI. The revolution of 1911 overthrew the Manchu Qing dynasty, uniting the Han, Manchu, Mongolian, Hui, and Tibetan regions into one country, such as combining the Han, Manchu, Mongolian, Hui, and Tibetan ethnic groups into one person, is called the unity of the nation. XXXII The implementation of the Republic of Five Nationalities in the Republic of China means that the task of the national revolution has been completed. Does it mean that the problem of nationalism has been completely solved? Sun Yat-sen replied to this: our country's racial revolution and political revolution have been successful, but the social revolution has not yet begun. XXXII The main task after XXXII is to launch a social revolution based on the people's livelihood principle. However, he quickly discovered from the political chaos in the early Republic of China, especially from the farce of Yuan Shikai's restoration and proclaiming himself emperor, that not only the political revolution was far from successful, the social revolution was far away, and the national revolution still had to be carried out in depth. His understanding of nationalism is not limited to the overthrow of the Manchu Qing rule and the establishment of the five-ethnic republic system, but redefines nationalism as all nations in the world are equal, all races in the world are equal, and one race must not oppress by other races. Cursive in 1924, the Chinese Kuomintang issued a manifesto at its first National Congress, redefining Sun Yat-sen's nationalism as, one is that the Chinese nation seeks its own liberation, the other is that all ethnic groups in China are equal, emphasizing that Kuomintang's the purpose of nationalism is to make the Chinese nation free and independent from the world. XXXV From January to March of the same year, Sun Yat-sen redefined nationalism as nationalism in a series of lectures on Three People's Principles, associating nation with country. Nationalism is considered to be the treasure for the development of the country and the survival of the race, and the most powerful ideological weapon against imperialist oppression and aggression. So far, Sun Yat-sen's nationalist theory has changed from the national revolution theory of expelling Manchuria to the five-ethnic republic theory after the revolution of 1911, and has further moved towards the anti-imperialist theory. The struggle of nationalism has shifted from inside to outside is not only to mobilize China to participate in the revolutionary movement against world powers, but also to encourage China to stand among the nations of the world, thus establishing the great goal of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. In his analysis of the modern fate of Confucian China, Levinson argued that Chinese nationalism arose as a self-contradictory doctrine, with a clear and growing internal tension, and that nationalists defended tradition with the aim of, in order to become a nationalist, they attack tradition at the same time. Nationalism and traditionalism are in an ambiguous relationship, and they use each other while distrusting each other. He concludes, Nationalism does not offer a final refuge because it is itself restless both in its efforts to defend and to successfully attack the declining authority of Confucianism. 30. This view seeks to reveal the double fate of nationalism in China. It is both deeply rooted in the hearts of the people, it becomes a new national ideology when traditionalism loses its appeal, and it does not help. Nationalism, by attacking traditionalism, makes itself caught in a paradox. However, Levinson obviously greatly underestimated the importance of nationalism to the resurgence of traditionalism, from system to ideology, and failed to deeply estimate the historical and institutional logic of China's nationalism problem. The fall of the Manchu Qing dynasty and the founding of the Republic of China marked the transition from an empire to a nation-state. Against this historical background, it was inevitable and legitimate for nationalism to constitute the trend of thought of the times. Different from the trend of the collapse of the old European empires leading to the independence of many nation-states, the Chinese empire did not disintegrate into several independent sovereign states in the nationalist movement. On the contrary, it continued to maintain politically a unified situation. This means that the problem of nationalism in China is quite different from the problem of nationalism in Europe. The difference between the two lies in the huge difference between empire and nation-state. The transition from the dynastic system to the Republic of China system only formally changed the political image of the empire, putting it on the cloak of a nation-state, but in fact it did not fundamentally change the imperial nature of the Republic of China system. Various ethnic issues such as the status of ethnic minorities, which still face continuous external impacts from the Western nation-state system. Most intellectuals in China regard external impacts as imperialist issues. That is to say, the problem of overpopulation was solved, but the problem of the imperial system was not really solved. The problem of anti-imperialism was solved, but the problem of the transformation of an empire into a nation-state was not really solved. The various tensions created by the nationalism issue inside and outside China will exist for a long time because of the existence of the overarching source of empire. This is the essence of China's nationalism problem. The nation-state problem in the post-imperial era. The end of the imperial era and the advent of the republic era. Is this the beginning of modern China, or the beginning of a nation-state? China's modern nation-building movement is closely related to the revolutionary movement, which can be described as the founding of the country by revolution. The Revolution of 1911 established the Yang government, the National Revolution established the national government, and the Communist Revolution established the people's government, dictatorship of the proletariat. The three national regimes were successively replaced. It constructed its political legitimacy in the name of the Revolution and the Republic of China, and inherited all the territory, population, and natural and human resources left over from the Manchu Empire. The question is, does the Republic mean the birth of a new nation-state? In Sun Yat-sen's three principles of the people plan, nationalism, and civil rights are highly consistent in terms of system construction. National independence means the realization of civil rights, from military administration, training administration to constitutional administration realize the unification of nation-states and democracies. Judging from the century-old history of the Republic of China, people often criticize and accuse the Kanyowei Plan or Sun Yat-sen plan of modern state building, thinking that they are either obsessed with traditional Chinese ideological resources and lack modern constitutionalism, or are obsessed with Western ideas. However, as Xiao Gongquan pointed out, the real tragedy lies not in Kang's failure to convince the people of the benefits of his modernization plan. Industrialization is not China, but in his hostile ideals. The method of establishing Westernization as modernization also failed. In the end, China was not governed by MR in the period of the Yang government or the national government. Freedom and democracy were a matter of more or less, while in the period of the people's government, freedom and democracy were a matter of presence or absence. In an era without civil rights, national independence, national self-determination, or nation-building were like castles in the air. People, nations, ethnic groups, or any social community were not political subjects, and political subjects were monopolized by a dominant political party. The era in which the form has the reality of an empire can be called the post-imperial era. In China's post-imperial era, the issue of nationalism has not been a problem for a long time. As far as the handling of ethnic relations within the country is concerned, the ethnic policy of the CCP is basically formulated according to Stalin's ethnic theory, that is, it fully affirms the rights of ethnic regional autonomy in form, but in fact it has never really granted the right to self-government to all ethnic groups. The central government's approach to dealing with ethnic issues refers to the institutional setting of the Li Fan Yuan in the Manchu Qing Empire. It strengthened the management and governance of minority areas by establishing such institutions as the Ethnic Committee, the United Front Work Department, and the Religious Affairs Bureau. The extent greatly surpassed that of the Manchurian government. As far as handling international relations outside the country is concerned, the CCP adheres to the principles of internationalism established by Marxism-Leninism, applies the methods of class analysis and class struggle to deal with international issues, and puts forward the theory of three worlds. The United States and the Soviet Union are the first world, Europe, Japan, and Australia are the second world, and the vast Asian, African, and Latin American countries are the third world. The CCP claims to be the main representative of the third world. However, as a staunch Marxist, Mao, like Stalin, did not abandon his nationalist stance. After Stalin's death, he has been trying to become the new leader of the international communist movement and at the same time become a mentor of world revolution. The Sino-Soviet split did not stem from the profound differences in the understanding of Marxism between the two parties, but from Mao's deep-seated nationalism complex, which created geopolitical tension between the Chinese and Soviet parties and countries. Benjamin Schwartz analyzed the source of nationalism of Maoism. During the war, Mao began to show a kind of independence to Moscow. Emotions used for its own cause. No longer content to explain his strategy in terms of the general theory of the United Front proclaimed by Moscow, but keen to demonstrate that China's developments represent a uniquely creative moment in the course of human history development. 38. Therefore, the Sino-Soviet break can be seen as a nationalist event. Benedict Anderson mentioned in the preface to his book Imagined Communities that one of the motivations that prompted him to write this book originated from the armed conflict that occurred in the Indochina Peninsula from 1978 to 1979. The invasion of Cambodia, followed by the war between China and Vietnam. Both sides of the war claimed to be socialist countries and believed in Marxism. For Anderson, the prospect of further all-out war between the socialist countries was always on my mind. 36 from which he recognized that nationalism had successfully infiltrated the socialist camp. A wedge was thrown, after the explosion of nationalism in the vast multilingual, multi-ethnic empires ruled by Vienna, London, Constantinople, Paris, and Madrid. Although the fuse has not yet been laid in Moscow, this does not mean that social instead. He cites Hobsbawm as proof that the Marxist movement and the Marxist state, both in form and in substance, have become national movements and national powers, that is, a tendency to transform into nationalism. There is nothing to suggest that this trend will not continue. After the last cloak of internationalism had been stripped, all the socialist countries revealed their true nationalism. Nationalism is essentially a historical phenomenon of nation-states. Whether Anderson regards the nation as an imagined political community or Kellner believes that nationalism makes the nation, not the other way around. Their definitions of nationalism come from the historical experience of European nation-states, including Anderson's understanding of the first wave of nationalism. Remote nationalism was actually formed under the historical premise of the development of European nation-states. Hobsbawm agrees with Kellner's concept of nation, emphasizing that nationalism is earlier than the establishment of nation, but he still believes that the establishment of nation is closely related to the contemporary sovereign state, modern territorial state, created based on a specific territory. The so-called nation-state will become meaningless if we do not discuss the territorial sovereign state together with nation or nationality. At the same time, modernity is the basic feature of the nation-state, which means that the nation-state is a synonym for the modern state. The European nation-state movement is the first wave of world modernization. Its content includes market economy, free trade, individual liberation, sound legal system and constitutional democracy, as well as the rapid growth of the national economy within the framework of modern governance. Judging from the double standards of the nation-state and the modern state, nationalism in the post-imperial era is not a historical phenomenon of the nation-state. As Anderson pointed out, the Soviet Union refused to use the nation to name the country. The successor of the dynastic state in the pre-national period in the 19th century, this basic judgment can also be used to explain China's institutional arrangements after the collapse of the imperial system. The war between China and Vietnam may look like a nationalist war, but in fact it is similar to the previous wars of the Central Dynasty to conquer or punish its vassal states. The purpose of the war was neither for territory nor for interests, but merely it is to maintain the etiquette order, face, of the Central Dynasty. In a sense, the Sino-Vietnamese border war can be regarded as a post-imperial war. It marked the complete bankruptcy of the principle of Marxist internationalism and at the same time heralded the recombination of nationalism and Marxism. It is against such an era background that how to deal with the relationship between Marxism, the imperial centralized state and nationalism has become an urgent theoretical need. China's reform and opening up originated from the failure of the traditional imperial governance system. In the early stage of reform, the whole country generally entered a state of national reflection, not only criticizing the inherent drawbacks of the traditional planned economic system, but also deeply reviewing the problems of traditional ideological resources. Therefore, it set off a trend of thought for comprehensively studying the advanced systems, cultures, and values of Western civilized countries, and started a process of national self-denial and self-reconstruction. However, with the great economic performance of the reform and opening up, the increasing national strength, and the major changes in the international situation and international power structure, a strong nationalist sentiment began to become the mainstream in the spiritual level of the Chinese people, and national self-denial and the process of self-reflection is replaced by a process of national self-aggrandizement and self-display. In 1981, when the Chinese women's volleyball team won the world championship for the first time, students at Peking University chanted the slogan "Unite, Rejuvenate China," a simple patriotism that quickly became the official ideology. After the mid-1990s, nationalist sentiment among the people was unprecedentedly hot. From China can say no and China is not happy to the sound of China is about to rule the world after 2000, nationalism has become the main theme of the times. The greatest consensus with the people has thus been established. Nationalism seems to reshape a Marxist state or a post-imperial state, asking in accordance with Anderson's definition of a nation as an imagined community, is the rampant proliferation of nationalism conceivable as China already being a nation country? The main theoretical representatives of the Chinese New Left, such as Wang Wei, Zhao Tingyang, Liu Xiaofen, etc., jointly choose the nation-state as the main object of criticism, because they have deeper theoretical intuition than those folk nationalists. The major difference between Chinese nationalism and European nationalism is the very different institutional arrangements of empires and nation-states. Therefore, in their view, the goal of China's reform and opening up is not to establish a nation-state, but rather to continue to maintain a powerful imperial centralized system. In his review of Kojève's outline of the French state, Liu Xiaofen linked Kojève's political ambition to rebuild the French Empire with Mao Zedong's vision of civilization and political behavior, and believed that the former did not think about modern the established form of nationalism, the form of a nation-state, but a new imperial alliance composed of joint nation-states. This imperial alliance shows the relationship between the nation-state and the imperial achievement. There is an inherent contradiction. In other words, the imperial enterprise is civilized, while the national state is not. Liu Xiaofen greatly appreciated Kojève's idea of rebuilding France's imperial achievements, mainly to explain that Mao Zedong's international strategic concept also had the nature of imperial achievements. The Latin nation in the outline of the French state was changed to the Chinese nation. Sliv Zhao Tinjiang's theory of Tianxia system is exactly the same as Liu Xiaofen's. It is essentially an attempt to establish a new narrative of empire. As he himself said, the theory of Tianxia/empire expresses an ideal about empire. In other words, the concept of perfection, Tianxia/empire has far surpassed the framework of nation/state in terms of legitimacy, and China's imperial history has become the blueprint for the theory of Tianxia/empire. XLB compared with Liu Xiaofen and Zhao Tingyang, Wang Wei constructed a set of more systematic and comprehensive imperial narratives. He not only tried to establish a historical continuity between Manchu empire building and modern state building, but it also tries to prove the unity of the two in system construction, that is, to prove the historical and realistic legitimacy of the empire at the same time. Wang Hui's criticism of the empire-nation-state dualism is that the nation-state narrative cannot fully reveal the nature and operation of the imperial form in the course of Chinese history, nor can it be regarded as the modern state model after the ultimate empire. Wang Hui's major inspirations from Negri and Hart's empire and other imperial studies are, one is a reflection on the globalization of the so-called post-nation state, the other it is the imperial studies relaunched from the dissatisfaction or reflection on the nation-state system, which is directly manifested in the re-excavation of the history of major pre-modern empires by many historians, as well as the study of the transcendence of the dominant narrative centered on the nation-state and its historical scale. SLB in short, using imperial narratives and post-nation-state narratives to oppose or replace nation-state narratives constitutes Wang Hui's the worldview and methodology of modern China studies. Proceeding from this worldview and methodology, Wang Wei does not believe that the concept of Tianxia can replace the concept of empire, although in his view, the concept of Tianxia was also proposed in response to the questioning of the nation-state, but this concept represents the uniqueness of China. Rather, it is a particularist narrative about China that starts from the basic knowledge of the nation-state, and it is not the result of deliberation. Slayai compared with this the concept of empire was identified by Wang Wei as having a universalist nature. It can not only fully describe specific dynasties and political entities and the characteristics of Chinese political culture, but also participate in world history and the world as a realistic concept of political entities. In the theoretical reconstruction of the system. In this sense, Wang Wei is a typical imperialist. The problem of nationalism in China can only be seen clearly in the binary opposition structure of empire-nation-state. Is it the nationalism of the empire or the nationalism of the nation-state? From universalism to nationalism. Before the comrades of China's new leftists collectively moved towards nationalism, almost all of them were universalists, or they believed in Confucian universalism and believed that Confucius theories could legislate for mankind forever, or they believed in Marxist universalism and believed in the ideal of communism must be realized all over the world, or believe in the universalism pioneered by Western Enlightenment, and firmly believe that freedom, democracy, constitutionalism, and human rights are universal values that all countries and nations should follow. In response to the theoretical crisis of Marxism, the principles of revolution, class struggle, violent revolution, and internationalism it promised were on the verge of bankruptcy in the practice of the international communist movement, which led to the loss of the basic principles of universalism it advocated. Theoretical credit. Confucian universalism, after experiencing the long-term and heavy blow of Marxism, finally ushered in the opportunity of revival in response to the situation of reform and opening up and the ideological liberation movement. It is obviously still a problem to draw out the blueprint of Confucian universalism and be recognized by the world. In comparison, only the system of thought and knowledge created by the Western Enlightenment over the past 200 years has acquired a universal form recognized by the world. The entire intellectual circle in China had a huge impact. From the perspective of the continuity of intellectual history, a series of ideas and concepts imported from the West, as well as epistemology, had been regarded by Confucians such as Kang Youwei, Liang Kikao, and Yan Pu in the late Qing dynasty as the world's axioms or common rules. They completely abandoned the traditional subject classification of classics and history and accepted the new Western knowledge classification method. According to Liang Kikao, not only historiography needs to follow the axioms and common rules, but other disciplines such as political science, group studies, sociology, religion, geography, geology, ethnology, anthropology, law, leveling science, economics, must be set according to axioms and common rules. Others, such as ethics, psychology, theory, and essay science, which belong to the scope of philosophy, and astronomy, material science, chemistry, and physiology, which belong to the scope of natural science, all must take from the axioms and common rules of all studies. Liang Kikao thought, the reason why a husband must seek its axioms and common rules is not to think that the theory is beautiful, but to put it into practical use and to benefit others. Slayai he further believes that Chinese social reform must also be to follow the axioms and rules of evolution actually requires planning China's modern state-building plan in accordance with the universal principles of Western civilized countries. Xiao Gongquan also mentioned in his book that Kang Youwei was not a Confucian who completely rejected Western thought. On the contrary, Kang began to appreciate the value of Western science in the 1880s. At the age of 25, he had read many books on mathematics and physics. He also worked hard to study astronomy and Western medicine, gained a lot of inspiration from modern Western science, and realized that British empirical science has opened a new era of modern times. The one who turned the millennium darkness and brought the stars to light is the pioneer of the Bigenchuang experimental school. And from Locke, Hobbes, Miller to Spencer, all British schools are materialistic, so they can achieve this great effect. Slicks therefore, Xiao Gongquan does not think that Kang's utopia is based on a Han nationality. It may be suspected of being great Han cultural imperialism, but believes that Kang's ideal is not only to destroy the country and the nation, but also that Confucianism has no place in the New World. In fact, Kang is not advocating nationalism or imperialism, but pure cosmopolitanism. L. During the ideological Enlightenment movement in the 1980s, Chinese intellectuals, like Kang Liang, also faced the ideological transformation of universalism, that is, from the universalism of Marxism to the universalism of Western Enlightenment, while the universalism of Confucianism, after being smashed by the fist of Marxism, doctrine is still in the stage of being put together again. In the theoretical atmosphere at that time, almost all the thought leaders who later became the Chinese New Left were believers in Western universalism. Thought and knowledge rebuild social science and humanities with reference to Western academic standards, and basically recognize the values on which Western Enlightenment thought is based. Gan Yang's article The Controversy Between Ancient and Modern China and the West, written in 1985, explained a common view at that time that the essence of China's problem was not the dispute between China and the West but the dispute between ancient and modern times. In his own words, a key issue, the reason is that the regional cultural differences between Chinese culture and Western culture are often highlighted infinitely, thus covering up the more substantive and fundamental cultural differences between ancient and modern times, that Chinese culture itself must move from traditional cultural forms to modern cultural forms. Li severely criticized Zhang Haidong's theoretical monster that Chinese learning is the essence and Western learning is practical. A major obstacle that will continue to be encountered throughout the process is a ghost that Chinese intellectuals will find it difficult to get rid of for a long time. Li, the author, draws on the experience of Japan's transformation during the Meiji period and believes that Japan also experienced there used to be models such as Eastern morality, Western technology, Japanese spirit, Western knowledge, but the Japanese finally realized that it is impossible to use this model to deal with modernization, because civilization as a whole, importing scientific and technological civilization, must mean importing Western philosophy, political law and other social sciences at the same time. Gan Yang draws a basic understanding from the different paths of modern transformation in China and Japan and their very different endings. Western culture is essentially a modern cultural form, and the cultural difference between Europe and the United Kingdom and the United States is only a modern cultural form. Form distinction. Therefore, the essence of the problem does not lie in the great differences between Chinese and Western cultures at all, but in that Chinese culture must break away from its traditional form and make great strides towards a modern form. Line. Gan Yang raised the controversy between China and the West to the level of controversy between ancient and modern to understand it. Molecular consensus. In order to achieve modernization in traditional China, we must first break through the ideological barriers of Confucianism and Marxism, and comprehensively study the universal historical experience and theoretical conclusions accumulated by Western countries in the process of modernization. However, as mentioned earlier, this consensus in the theoretical circles did not last long. In the 1990s, the Chinese New Left, which took the responsibility of criticizing Enlightenment and modernization models, took the lead in breaking away from the Enlightenment community and breaking with the universalism of Enlightenment. Re-chosen to ally with the universalism of Confucianism and Marxism, and stand together under the banner of nationalism. After this major theoretical transformation, Gan Yang no longer played the role of a traditional critic. In 2005, he put forward the theoretical proposition of combining the three traditions, combining Confucianism, Confucian tradition, Maoist tradition, Mao Zedong's tradition, and Deng Xiaoping's tradition, are unified into a theoretical system, and at the same time, they no longer regard Western culture as the only standard for modernization, and emphasize the need to re-understand China. Re-understanding means reviewing our past. Regarding our own views on China, we believe that over the past century, we have been too eager to incorporate ourselves into one or another universal model, and have actually ignored the uniqueness of Chinese civilization. This uniqueness is fully manifested in China as a traditional civilization. Great empires have not disintegrated into many nation-states in the modern transformation. Proceeding from the logic of the so-called combining the three traditions, Gan Yang turned from a traditional critic to a traditional defender. Today we not only need to re-examine the relationship between the Reform era and the Mao era, but also need to re-examine the relationship between modern China and traditional China. We should not oppose modern China and China's historical civilization and tradition, but also look at traditional China and traditional China. Continuity in modern China. Live. In the process of thinking, scholars deny themselves in response to changes in the times and situations, and move from the old self to the new self. This phenomenon is not uncommon in the history of thought, and it does not violate academic ethics. Emphasizing the continuity between traditional China and modern China, re-arguing the legitimacy of imperial history, and criticizing Western Enlightenment and modernization models, as a theoretical research option, there is also unquestionable legitimacy in academics. Academic freedom means theoretical research be open to all realms of possibility. The question is, what is the motivation for the ideological transformation? What is the reason that former Enlightenment intellectuals such as Wang Wei, Zhao Tingyang, Liu Xiaofen, and Gan Yang became the vanguard of anti-Enlightenmentism? The rise of China and the rejuvenation of the nation are of course a huge external background. How China reparticipates in the reconstruction of the world order and the world knowledge system has become a major theoretical mission of nationalism. This is the folk nationalist, something that is simply unattainable. In Zhao Tingyang's words, China's knowledge system must participate in the construction of the world's knowledge system and thus produce a new worldwide knowledge system and become a big knowledge production country. To be responsible, one cannot have nothing to say to the world, one must be able to give thoughts about the world, and China's worldview has become the first problem. It has already been on the stage, so it has to speak. This is China's current ideological task and necessary logic. LB, that is to say, China was a primary school student learning from Western countries in the early days of reform and opening up. Now that China is strong, it is not only a large economic production country, but also a large knowledge production country. It has to change from a knowledge input country to a knowledge exporting countries. China and Western countries must compete for the right to speak in the world. It turned out that Gan Yang regarded the essence of China's problems not as the dispute between China and the West but as the dispute between ancient and modern times. Struggle. China and the West, from the dispute over systems, the dispute between empire and nation-state, to the dispute over ideas, knowledge, and values, evolved the anti-imperialist nationalism established during Sun Yat-sen's period into anti-Western nationalism, that is, the evolution. It is a complete negation of the Enlightenment tradition, modernization model, and civilization model marked by the West in the field of thought and theory. According to Wang Wei, if contemporary nationalism cannot be considered from the perspective of the global political, economic, and military structures, then no matter whether they actively support the nationalist movement or vigorously oppose the nationalist movement, they may miss the problem. The fundamental crux. LBI He attributed the fundamental crux of the problem to whether the Chinese intellectuals can establish a theory of Chinese modernity that is fundamentally different from the discourse of New Enlightenmentism. To establish the theory of Chinese modernity and challenge Fairbank's tradition modern model, it is necessary to redefine the concepts of tradition and modernity into the category of tradition without any modern significance. Therefore, in order to re-establish the basic position of these traditional political concepts in Chinese modernity theory, we must first challenge the universalism of the Western discourse system. How to complete this theoretical work? There are actually two lines within the Chinese New Left. One is represented by Liu Xiaofen and Zhang Xiudong. They are trying to elevate their understanding of China on the premise of acknowledging the universalist nature of Western thought and knowledge. To the height of universalism. Liu Xiaofen mentioned in the preface of the revised edition of Salvation and Freedom that the encounter between modern China and the West cannot avoid a spiritual conflict, and the encounter between nations is usually a contest of national physical strength, economic, political, military. The strong nation exploits and assimilates the weak nation. In his view, even if the economic and political strength of the Chinese nation restrains the imperial capitalist nation, the absolute spirit, the real philosophical problem, will not be solved accordingly. Spirit is ultimately individual, transcendent history, free action beyond a nation. He regards his works as towards the spirit of the absolute, not the spirit of the West or China. Lei Zhang Xiudong advocated in his historical reflection on Western universalist discourse, the Chinese problem itself is part of the universal problem in the world, but contemporary Chinese thought needs a special entry point. The particularity of this point, it does not come from the issue of China being external to universality, but from the fact that China can gain a new understanding of the particularity relationship inside the original concept of universality when reflecting on and understanding its own universality, and thus through its own participation in the understanding of this reconstruction and transformation of relationships, expanding the richness, inclusiveness and unity within the scope of universality. Lei Yin, different from Liu Xiaofen and Zhang Xiudong, Wang Wei created a more radical theoretical line to criticize Western universalism within the New Left. Although he acknowledged the conception, program, and design of the nation-state in Europe and a kind of universalist knowledge, there are profound connections, including acknowledging that the national and social transformation of Eastern countries such as Japan occurred after the full acceptance of Western thought and knowledge systems, and understanding the concept of century as a Western concept of time. But his theory points to it is to establish a set of Chinese modernity theories that are completely different from Western modernization theories, including the rewritten imperial narrative, the Confucian view of heavenly principles, the Marxist view of revolutionary history, and Mao Zedong's anti-modern modernity theory, and try to reconstruct or replace the Western universalist discourse with this set of narratives. Through these theoretical explanations and proofs, Wang Hui finally tried to establish a unique nationalist narrative about China within the category of empire. I have explored the different meanings of the category China from different angles and aspects, trying to liberate this concept from the national identity of a purely European nationalist model. China is relatively the category of ethnic groups is richer, more flexible, and more able to include diversity. It plays an important role in rebuilding the legitimacy of ethnic minority dynasties, reconstructing the equal relationship between different ethnic groups within the dynasty, and shaping the tribute or diplomacy between different political communities. The category has shown unique resilience and adaptability in relation to relationships. Licks. A discourse of imperial nationalism that is different from nation-states is clearly revealed here. Hitler once said that he wanted to build a social national empire and a welfare state. Social barriers will be dismantled one by one, leaving only the exclusive status of state and head of state. LX isn't Wang Hui's imperial nationalism the Chinese version of Hitler's social national empire? The chorus of nationalism in China has multiple voices, and the voices of nationalism from the bottom of the society, in the eyes of Chinese New Left scholars, are tantamount to vulgar nationalism. Authors like Say No sat down to discuss nationalism, including not publishing their research in the Global Times. Compared with the rising nationalist sentiment among the people in the past 10 years, the nationalism research of the above-mentioned scholars seems extremely calm, rational and objective. Their research on empire, Tianxia and Chinese modernity is full of various postmodern academic. The rhetoric shows a theoretical depth that is difficult for the general public to understand. However, their value orientation is highly consistent with the vulgar nationalism at the bottom, that is, from anti-imperialist, anti-Western to anti-American, including against Asian countries such as Japan and South Korea, and reconstructed the Sinocentric view of history challenges the existing international order and the universal human values established by the Enlightenment. Only in one key point, they are significantly different from folk nationalism, that is, they choose to stand with the state and voluntarily become a vassal of nationalism. From nationalism to nationalism. Nationalism based on the nation narrative has its legal and justifiable reasons both academically and morally. National identity and cultural identity, the awakening of national consciousness, the publicity of national spirit, and the venting of national emotions are all the natural rights of nations are inalienable. Only when nationalism and statism converge does nationalism based on the narrative of the state reveal its extreme, vulgar, and destructive nature. The official name of Nazism in history is National Socialism, which can also be called National Socialism. In the context of nationalism created by the Nazis, country and nation became synonymous language. In Nation and State, Hugh Heaton Watson argues that in common usage in English and other modern languages, the very different concepts state and nation are often confusingly used. The state may not consist of a single nation, but of many nations in a community. Generally speaking, nationalist movements seek two goals. One is national independence, that is, the establishment of a sovereign state with the nation as the main body. The other is national unity, that is, all ethnic groups within a country's territory are fused into one nation. Two prominent sovereign states in European history, France and Great Britain, show that the birth of the state goes hand in hand with the formation of the nation, and that the nation is formed within the borders of the state. But this situation does not mean that the boundary between country and nation disappears. A nation is a de jure political organization with the power to demand obedience and loyalty from its citizens. A nation is a community of certain kinds of people whose members are bound together by ideas of solidarity, common culture, and national consciousness. LXI. Gellner explained the difference between a state and a nation by citing Max Weber's famous definition of a state. A state is an institution in society with a monopoly on the rational use of violence. A nation is a shared cultural identity and belief, a product of loyalty and solidarity. From this, he believes that the normative concept of nation in the modern sense does not necessarily presuppose the existence of the state prior to it, and the problem of nationalism cannot be explained by the concept or logic of the state. Z.I. Marx also summarized the difference between the state and the nation in German ideology. He believed that with the development of capitalism, the civil society and the commercial and industrial life it included needed to be defined as nationality. The appearance of a state has to be formed in the form of a country internally. It can be understood from this that nation and nationalism embody an external position or attitude, while state and statism embody an internal ruling relationship. No matter how much people differ in their understanding of the concepts of nation and country, the basic consensus is that country is a political concept, which mainly refers to the sovereignty, governance, and rule of a country, while nation is an anthropological concept, mainly pointing to a social community based on a common language, beliefs, and living customs. When intellectuals in the late Qing dynasty had just acquired a kind of national consciousness under the influence of the West, most of them could not distinguish the difference between nation and country, and often confused the two together. Although Confucianism does not have the concept of nationality, the concept of country has long existed in the family, country, and world. Kang Youwei proposed protecting the country, preserving the species, and protecting the religion to show the world the national crisis, racial crisis, and cultural crisis facing China. However, in Liang Kekeo's view, in China's past, how could there be a country? It's just that there was an imperial court. The so-called Tang, Yu, Xia, Shang, Zhou, Qin, Han, Wei, Jin, Song, Qi, Liang, Chen, Sui, Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing are all dynasty names. The dynasty is the private property of the family, the state is the public property of the people. Awakening is also the awakening of national consciousness. Regarding Kang Youwei's theory of protecting education, Liang Kekeo also disagreed, emphasizing that I love Confucius, but I love the truth, I love the ancestors, but I love the country, I love the old people, but I love freedom. The advanced elements in the late Qing dynasty represented by Liang Kekeo had realized that under the dynastic political structure, national and national independence could not be discussed. The success of the Revolution of 1911 led to the establishment of the Republic of China and the realization of the Republic of five ethnic groups. The country replaced the imperial court as a new authority, and at the same time became a political community higher than the nation. In the eyes of many, national rejuvenation depends on the independence and strength of the country. Sun Yat-sen and Kang Youwei represented two opposing national construction routes in the early period of the Republic of China. The former's Three People's Principles plan advocated that the transition from national revolution to political revolution to realize civil rights must go through a period of military administration, and the essence of military administration is to rely on the state violently unify the military and government orders across the country, and then transition to political training and constitutional government. In view of the political chaos in the early period of the Republic of China, the latter advocated that saving China is the most important plan, and the country is more important than the people, before serving the country and then serving the people, and it is more important than serving the country than serving the people. Uxi both actually became a status during the political transition period of the Republic of China. After the Kuomintang unified the country and established the national government, the main problems it faced at that time were, the country's military and financial capabilities were extremely weak, local separatism was serious, the development of national industries was struggling, and the geopolitical tension between China and Japan was increasingly trending towards war. At a critical juncture in domestic and foreign affairs, many intellectuals began to tend to support status autocratic policies. American scholar Greedle observed an important ideological phenomenon in China in the 1930s, that is, some famous scholars from the West switched from a liberal standpoint to support for authoritarianism. In the discussion of democracy and autocracy in Oriental Magazine, Independent Review and other progressive nonpartisan publications at that time, returnees such as Zhang Tingfu, Ding Wenjiang, and Jian Ruizheng all advocated that China needs a centralized government that produces maximum talent, efficiency and competitiveness. According to Ding Wenjiang, China's realistic choice is not democracy or autocracy, but old-fashioned autocracy and new-style autocracy. He believes that the leadership of the latter can put the interests of the country above the interests of parties or classes. Zhang Tingfu also believes that the only way to solve China's problems is to implement one-man dictatorship. In Bridle's view, modern Chinese scholars easily choose the most extreme form of nationalism authoritarianism as an option to solve China's real problems, which is in line with the Confucian political tradition. Confucian political thinking naturally does not have the concept of limited government. Confucianism and revolutionary socialists have a common view of the state, that is, the state as an all-encompassing society of belief. From the 1930s to the 21st century, after more than half a century, China has undergone tremendous changes in the form of the state. With the help of the dual forces of power and the market, a huge state machine was born. It has the world's largest, it has a standing army and various advanced weapons, has the world's largest foreign exchange reserves, has the world's largest financial capacity and the ability to develop various resources. This is an unprecedented giant leviathan in human history. In terms of its scope of control, capabilities, and nature, it surpasses the three major empires in Chinese history, the Qin and Han empires, the Sui and Tang empires, the Song and Ming empires. Does this mean the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation? Or does it mean that the old glory of the Chinese empire will be restored in the new century? If the free intellectuals in the 1930s chose to use autocratic methods to strengthen the power of the state to rule society, it was just a political strategy, and their ultimate goal was to build a constitutional nation-state. Then, for Chinese New Left scholars, they say that rebuilding a huge empire-like state is their ideal goal. Otherwise, Wang Hui would not have to take such painstaking efforts to confront the modern nation-state narrative with a reconstructed empire narrative, and Zhao Tingyang and Liu Xiaofeng would not have to take such painstaking efforts to use Tianxia/empire or imperial alliance to restructure the world order. From nationalism to statism is not a one-step leap. At least from the 1990s to the beginning of the 21st century, when the Chinese New Left claimed to be critical intellectuals and broke with Enlightenment intellectuals, they still looked like a sincere nationalists, while opposing the global marketization process dominated by the Western modernization model, also deliberately keep a certain distance from nationalism. They know very well in their hearts that purely becoming a vassal of nationalism can neither be accepted by the long-standing democratic values adhered to by the Western left-wing tradition, nor can it be recognized by the working people in China. Wang Hui published an investigation report on the restructuring of a state-owned enterprise in Jiangsu in 2005. The theme was restructuring and the historical destiny of the Chinese working class. Regardless of the authenticity of the survey report, it still points out common problems in the restructuring of state-owned enterprises. The government regards privatization as the only goal of restructuring, which leads to weak news supervision, poor legal channels, lax trade union organizations, and government shirk responsibilities. Policies and regulations are unclear, and state assets are lost. He believes, through the analysis of this typical case, we can not only see the general difficulties and crises faced by the restructuring of state-owned enterprises in China, but also see the real starting point for exploring the path of democracy in China. Democracy must start from the ordinary workers to maintain themselves. The struggle to determine one's own interests and one's own destiny begins. 6. However, these rare words in Wang Hui's writings advocating for the rights of the working class were quickly submerged in a nationalist narrative. He put forward the theory of super party, which believes that the revolutionary party and the people have a natural unity. Party-state system. In fact, the consciousness of nationalism has become the collective consciousness of the Chinese New Left after they bid farewell to Enlightenmentism. This consciousness is growing with the continuous expansion of state power and energy in reality. Su Jilin's 2011 article The Spectre of Leviathan Criticism of Nationalism in the Past 2000s revealed an important ideological change of the Chinese New Left, that is, from nationalism to statism. The New Left originally insisted on two basic positions. One is to sympathize with and praise the people at the bottom, and the other is to hate Western capitalism and its democracy, and hold a critical attitude towards state power. However, after the 21st century, they began to turn to the right and embrace the country in an all-round way, and the radical left evolved into conservative nationalism. In order to sing the chorus of public opinion praising the great 60 years, they regard the first 30 years and the next 30 years as the consistent successful experience of the Chinese socialist model through selective forgetting and memory mechanisms. Later, more New Left scholars joined the ranks of statism, and conducted comprehensive research on the legitimacy of statism in various disciplines such as philosophy, political science, economics, law, and history. Su Jilin believes, these sudden turns reveal a major adjustment of the New Left's political strategy in the new political environment. When resorting to direct elections or democracy at the bottom is suppressed and impracticable, there the political center of gravity shifted from appealing to the society to expecting the will of the state, and from the downward route of walking the people to the upward route of walking the way for the king. LXX. In the multi-part chorus of nationalism that the Chinese New Left participated in, the participants sang the same theme from their respective intellectual and theoretical backgrounds. The state determines all areas of society's politics, economy, culture, and life. The state is the master of the nations. For example, Huang Gong and Wang Xiaoguang's theory of strengthening national capacity, Wang Xiaoguang's theory of people's democracy, Gan Yang's theory of political nation, Zhang Shigong's theory of Schmidtism, the will of the party and the state is the will of the state. Theory, Wang Hui's theory of super-political party and party-state unity, Zhang Weiwei's theory of Chinese government is necessary good, Western government is necessary evil. Pan Wei's theory of Chinese Communist Party is an advanced ruling group. Zhang Suguang's Chinese Road theory. Zhu Suli's Great Country Constitutional System theory. Kui Zaiwen's Institutional Innovation theory. Han Yuhei's 500-year Chinese National Rejuvenation theory. Zhao Tinjiang's Tianxia System theory. Lu Xiaofen's theory, the Holy King Revolution theory, etc. We'll see these theories are based on different knowledge resources, different narrative strategies, and different theoretical depths, but they all point to a grand and absolute nationalist narrative. The head of state is regarded as a decisive factor in determining historical development and social development. In the context of strong nationalism, nationalism is directed toward a kind of official nationalism or patriotism, and national identity is transformed into a political identity. To love the nation is to love the country, to love the country is to love the party, to love the party loves the leader, which is exactly the same as the equating of the country with the court and the monarch in the imperial era. According to Benedict Anderson's definition, official nationalism as a phenomenon of the third wave of nationalism came from the nation-building policy of the Russian Empire, in which the state used a real, mass nationalist fervor, and a systematic, even Machiavellian, indoctrination of nationalist ideology through the mass media, the education system, and administrative control to foster loyalty and agree. Anderson puts it succinctly. These official nationalisms are best understood as a means of simultaneously combining domestication with the preservation of dynastic powers, especially their dominion over the vast multilingual territories that had accumulated from the Middle Ages onwards, or, to put it another way, a means of stretching the short, tight skin of the nation large enough to cover the bulk of the empire. Patriotism is a special expression of nationalism. This is the discourse that the rulers of the empire are most willing to hear and use. They mobilize various propaganda tools to portray themselves as a symbol of the country, and through various political coercion and material inducements they deify themselves as the object of support of folk patriots by means of cults and personality cults, and patriotism became a nationalist ideology that officials can manipulate at will. One of Anderson's most incredible observations from the two world wars is that it was not so much the wars that allowed people to kill on an unprecedented scale as the untold number of people who were persuaded to throw their lives away. These people voluntarily rushed to the battlefield under the agitation of patriotism and became cannon fodder for the war. The incomparable lofty morality of being willing to die to defend one's own country often becomes the most powerful ideological tool for the ruler to manipulate the people at will in a country where the people are not masters of the country. As Hobsbawm said, once a country can successfully integrate nationalism into patriotism and make nationalism the central emotion of patriotism, then it will become the most powerful weapon of the government. The tide of nationalism and patriotism, which is rampant in the context of Chinese nationalism, has also become the most powerful weapon of the ruler. It ultimately points to two goals. One is to regard the growing strength of the state ruling machine as the great revival of the nation. The second is to persist in imagining an eternal enemy in the external world in order to maintain the unity of the country from imperialism to external hostile powers. The centuries-old history of modern China has experienced revolutions, wars, regime changes, and generational transitions. An old empire has been destroyed, but a modern nation-state and democratic country has not been established. A powerful imperial logic has always dominated the social, political, and economic systems. Evolution, under the conditions of the new century, has written a national myth that is far more grand than the old empire. In this historical process, intellectuals based on different cultural identities, Confucians, liberals, and Marxists had either sincerely believed that the great rejuvenation of the nation could be brought about through the power of the state, or imagined that a strong state could lead to a modern state. In the transformation of a constitutional state, have these dreams come true or have they been completely shattered? For the Chinese New Left, the nationalist blueprint they participated in, from the empire narrative to the Tianxia system theory to the Holy King Revolution theory, presents a firm political belief or political speculation. Chinese history has repeatedly proved that people who look forward to becoming imperial teachers or national teachers will eventually end up no more than a vassal role of nationalism. Marx once made an extremely accurate prediction about his own theoretical prospects. I sowed the dragon seed, but reaped the flea. We can also use this prophecy of Marx to look forward to the theoretical prospects of China's New Left. The sown dragon seeds of nationalism hatched empire fleas one by one.